Alright, so now that we've taken the time to go through our preferences and set up Ableton properly, let's go ahead and take a closer look at the interface, starting with the transport controls. So starting from the left, we have the follow option, and if you remember in our preferences, we actually had the ability to select an input channel, and then we can play an instrument or even use our voice to manipulate the tempo of Ableton. So if we were to enable this, Live would try to start following the tempo that we're speaking at, because my mic is currently set to the input of the follow tempo option. Now, Ableton's link option would also show up here, but we have that selected to hide, so that's not here currently, but we could do the same thing to manipulate some of the parameters within Ableton Live. Next, we have the tap tempo option, and we can tap out at tempo here, and Live will do its best to match the tempo at which we're tapping. Here we have the tempo display. Let's go ahead and set that back to 90. You can type in values or drag up and down, just like a slider. And next to our tempo option, we have nudge options. So if you're at some kind of live venue or you're trying to match your live set to the tempo of a song that you hear somewhere, you can temporarily increase or decrease the tempo at which you're playing back. And this just helps line up the audio in live situations a little bit easier. Next, we have some options for the time signature. We can manipulate either the numerator or the denominator by sliding or typing in values. To the right of the time signature, we have options for our metronome. We can enable the metronome to give us a click track during playback, and we can also drop down this little bar here for a few more options. First of all, we can set a count in here. We also had the ability to set the count in within the preferences, but this is just a little bit more accessible. Next, we can adjust the sound. I prefer the wood sound here. I think it sounds a little better. And we can adjust the rhythm. Now, the rhythm is a really cool option because if we're playing something, say like triplets, it really helps us out. So we can set this to triplets, and the metronome will click at triplet intervals. So this makes recording tricky rhythms a breeze. We're just going to go ahead and set that back to auto. And we have our last option here, enable only while recording. So this is pretty self-explanatory. Basically, it will shut the metronome off unless you are recording while still having the metronome enabled. So we can leave this enabled here, and now we'll only hear it when we're actually recording. Next to the metronome, we have a global quantization option, and this really refers to clip launching in the session view. We'll be coming back and looking at how we can do really cool things with our quantization settings, but for now, just know that this is our global quantization setting, and we can come up here to change the value. Moving on to the center portion of the transport controls, we have a follow option, and basically, if you remember in our preferences, we set our follow behavior to either page or scroll. I set mine to scroll, so when I click this and initiate playback, you'll see that our cursor is kept in the middle. Next to the follow option, we have our insert markers placement. We can adjust that by clicking and dragging, and we can also type values, and you'll see playback will start from wherever the insert marker rests. Next, we have the three main controls of the software. We can start playback, we can stop playback, we can double click the stop button to go back to the very beginning of our session, and we have our record option. Next, we have our arrangement overdub option, and this allows us to record multiple passes of MIDI in one go. So basically, if we have this enabled, we can create a MIDI clip and set that MIDI clip to loop, and each time it passes through, we can add a note and continuously record while retaining our already recorded notes. The next option is the automation arm button, and this actually allows us to record automation. Now, it's going to be based on your preferences, so you can either have it set up to record automation in arm tracks only or all tracks, and basically whatever preferences you have set, this is going to allow you to record automation in those tracks. Keep in mind that when you're recording from the session view to the arrangement view, any automation within the clips on the session view is going to be transferred over to the arrangement view, regardless of whether the automation arm button is active or not. Next up, we have the re-enable automation button, and this is helpful for when you adjust some automated parameter. Automation actually becomes disabled on that parameter. However, it's not lost because of this re-enable automation button. We can just select this here, and our automation will go back to the way that it was set up. Next, we have a capture MIDI option, which actually allows you to capture MIDI performances that weren't being recorded. So if you play something on your keyboard and you liked it, you can hit this capture MIDI button, and Live will do its best to create a MIDI clip with all the notes you played. Now, keep in mind that the tempo information might change. So if you capture MIDI on an empty session, meaning there's no other clips in the entire arrangement view, then Live is going to do its best to change the tempo to match the tempo that it thinks you were playing when you played that clip. However, if there are clips in the arrangement view or in the session view, then Live is simply going to try to make your playing match the tempo at which Ableton is already set at. So just keep that in mind if you're using the capture MIDI option a lot. Next up, we have the session record button, and this is something I forgot to mention, but this record button, this main button, is actually the arrangement view recording button. So you can actually record clip launching performances from the session straight into the arrangement view with this button, and we'll be going in depth on how to do that and the benefits of doing that. But for now, just keep in mind that the arrangement view has a separate recording button than the session view. The next options all have to do with the loop brace. So starting off, we have a slider to manipulate the position of the loop brace, and then at the end we can manipulate the length of the loop brace. In the middle, we have punch recording options and a loop activator. So when the loop brace is activated, we can loop a specific section, and keep in mind that you can also come straight into the timeline and manipulate the loop brace. You'll see that our values are updated in real time. So if we play it now, once we reach the end of the loop brace, the insert marker will circle on back to the beginning. We can activate and deactivate the loop brace using Control or Command L, and we can drag the loop brace to really fine divisions. Now, the buttons to the left and the right of the loop brace are known as punch recording buttons. So this is your punch in button, and this is your punch out button. And this allows us to utilize a technique known as punch recording. So punch recording allows you to take the loop brace and set it up where you want to record. Now, once you have it set up, Live will only record in this designated area. So it takes the loop brace, and you can start playback before the loop brace, and still Live will only start a recording once it passes the threshold of the loop brace. Now here you can punch in or you can punch out. You can do either or, both, or none. So if we were to only punch in, Live would start the recording once it hit the loop brace, and then it would continue on recording until we manually hit the stop button. However, if punch out was on, then Live would start recording once we entered the loop brace and stop recording once we left the loop brace. Now, moving on, we have options for the draw mode, and the draw mode in Ableton basically allows you to draw notes within the MIDI editor as though you are using a pencil. So let me show you what I'm talking about. If we select this MIDI clip, we can actually come into the MIDI editor, and we can access the draw mode by pressing B on our computer keyboard, and now we can draw notes in here. However, if we don't have draw mode activated, we can still double click to input notes. It's just a little bit slower. Our next option actually allows us to use our computer's keyboard as though it were a MIDI controller. So here we've enabled this option. Let's go ahead and arm this piano track. And if I play some keys on my computer keyboard, you can see we're actually playing notes. Next up, we have our key mapping option. We can enable this and select a control to map to our computer keyboard. I'm going to go ahead and map the record option to R. We can disable the key mapping mode. And now every time I hit R, we are toggling the record button. Next up, we have our MIDI mapping option, which allows us to do the same thing, however, using a MIDI controller. So we can go ahead and select this mode, and then we can select any parameter that we wanted to map to our MIDI controller. move that knob, press that button on our MIDI controller, and it will be mapped. Now we'll be coming back to look at some more advanced MIDI mapping options, such as minimum and maximum zones, but for now keep in mind that you can map just about any parameter to a MIDI controller or to your computer keyboard for that matter. Next up, we have our CPU load meter, which will display either the average or the current CPU usage. And this is important to keep in mind because, as you saw when we were doing our test tone video, if your CPU is working too hard, you're going to get audible distortion, you're going to get pops, you're going to get clicks, and things that are going to mess with your recordings. So it's important to keep an eye on this number and manage it. Now, next to the CPU load meter, we have the overload indicator, and this will actually display the words CPU or disk if either your CPU is having an overload issue or your hard disk is having an overload issue. Now, you can get CPU usage issues if you're using too many plugins or devices, or you just have a lot of tracks and your computer's struggling, and you can get disk overload issues if your hard drive is just moving a little bit slow and it's not able to access the files as quickly as you're trying to play them back in Ableton. So there are different techniques and ways that we can manage our CPU usage, and I'll be showing you these later in the course. Just keep in mind that it is a really important and valuable resource that we want to save throughout the music making process. So make sure to spend some time getting comfortable with all the controls up here in the transport bar. We will be coming back to them constantly throughout the course, and it will only give you a leg up to have a good knowledge and understanding of what these controls do and how to use them.